Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this very special webinar, Talking for Teens about Anti-Asian Discrimination in the Era of COVID-19, Guidance from Research and Practice. My name is Juliana Chen, and I am the Associate Director of the MGH Center for Cross-Cultural Student Emotional Wellness. We are thrilled to have so many of you joining us from across the US and also overseas, and so grateful to have you here for this very important event.
Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. I am the center's program coordinator, Jiaming Liu. As anti-Asian discrimination and xenophobia continue to grow, it is critical for us as a community to talk about what is happening, to understand the impact on our daily lives, and to learn what we can do to advocate for ourselves and support the emotional well-being and safety of those most vulnerable. We are so glad to have you with us.
And if we could have the slides. Thank you. So through today's webinar, we hope to provide some brief background in the history of anti-Asian discrimination and talk about how COVID-19 has shifted the landscape for what our youth and community are having to face each day. We'll hear from the main authors of our newly launched parent guide on how to talk about anti-Asian discrimination with teens. They'll share a bit about how the guide came to be, why conversations are so critical, and practical strategies for having conversations at home. We'll hear as well about our current research efforts and how parents can contribute to help increase understanding and inform the development of culturally informed interventions in our community, followed by some time for Q&A and discussion with all of you. So our aim today is to shed light and to facilitate conversations around this painful but important topic, and hopefully to help us all engage in meaningful ways as a community.
We'll be using the Zoom Q&A feature, so please feel free to submit questions there at any time. We may take some questions as we go, and we'll go through as many as we can during the Q&A portion. We have such an incredible turnout. This webinar is being live streamed on YouTube for all those who weren't able to join us in this virtual space. And this event is being recorded and will be made available through our website for future viewings. We will send the recording link once uploaded to the registered emails.
Next slide. So we do have a terrific panel of speakers with us. We're going to just jump right in. I am so pleased to introduce our first two speakers, both close friends and colleagues. Justin Chen, who is the Executive Director of the MGH Center for Cross-Cultural Student Emotional Wellness, and Chris Hom, Chair and Associate Professor at Boston University School of Social Work, both of whom will speak to some of the history and background of anti-Asian discrimination, the current climate, and its impacts. If I could invite Justin to join.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Juliana, Jiaming, everyone else who's made this event possible. So I'll try to keep my remarks brief because I think the main stars of this event are going to be the amazing folks who put together this toolkit. But I do want to provide a little bit of context for what we're seeing and hearing about, and really make the point that this anti-Asian racism that we're seeing now is not new. So if we go to the next slide. I certainly don't need to be the one to tell you, you've all seen the kind of steady drumbeat of terrible headlines that all of us have been exposed to since March. People of Asian descent, not just Chinese, but all different ethnicities being attacked all over the world, in UK, in Germany, also affecting children. There are some headlines here I'm showing you of children being attacked, teens in Los Angeles. If we hit next, I'm not sure when this paused, but there were just so many of these. No Chinese allowed. Calls to nuke China, what's spreading faster than coronavirus, racist assaults and ignorant attacks. And it didn't matter if you were a person on the street or if you were a doctor or a nurse, you were equally at risk. There were also a lot of headlines suggesting the politicians' use of certain racially charged phrases like the Wuhan virus or the China virus were directly contributing to this. And I certainly think that's the case. In addition, the assaults have not just been verbal, obviously, they've also been physical. And you see this very disturbing headline of the Texas man accused of stabbing an Asian family. Well, we've heard of a lot more events like that in recent days and weeks. And finally, I end on this image here, Chingchang, you have Chinese virus, 1 in 4 Asian American youths experience racist bullying. So next slide, this is why we're all here. And so this amazing organization called Stop AAPI Hate was an initiative that was formed last March And it basically set up after hearing about these incidents and wanted to track and respond to all of these incidents of violence and discrimination against Asian Americans. They've in the year 2020, since March began, received over 2,800 reports of discrimination. But this report, which was released in September, was focused specifically on youths. And at the time, there were 2,500 reports of discrimination or hate, of which 16% had involved youth, over 50% involving anti-Chinese hate speech, and a full 7% involving a physical assault against youth. And importantly, although adults were present in about half of the cases, bystanders intervened in only about a tenth. So that's really a big gap. And if you hit next slide, you'll see a quote, which I think summarizes how many folks felt. This was a Stop AAPI Hate youth intern who said, "The constant feeling that I must have a heightened awareness of my surroundings whenever my family and I go outside made me feel vulnerable." And I think that's really, it makes me angry when I hear this. It makes me very sad for these young people who are vulnerable, and it's through no fault of their own being attacked by those around them. Next slide. So better than I could even share it, I wanted to play a brief New York Times video. And Timmy, you can go ahead and play the video now. Basically just documenting one young Asian American woman's experience during this time.
Chinese people are disgusting. They'll eat any type of animal. They're dirty. That's what my classmate said just days after the coronavirus outbreak started in the United States. It felt like a stab to my chest. I'm Chinese American, and this is someone that I've gone to school with for almost 3 years, who I consider a friend. But it's no wonder that she feels this way.
An obscure virus arising from a meat market in eastern China.
As the coronavirus spreads, there's another virus spreading that we need to be talking about.
I hate Asians.
A woman who's Asian says she was punched by another woman in Midtown Manhattan, and she accused her of having the COVID-19 virus.
I don't want them under me. Tell them to move.
Young Asian Americans like me are feeling hate infect every part of our lives.
I'd like to just ask the Chinese for a formal apology.
Not only do we have to be afraid about our health, but we have to be afraid about being ourselves.
Class basically just started, and one of the girls said all Chinese people were disgusting. And so I literally raised my hand up, like, I'm Chinese. She didn't even say sorry. She just blew past it, I guess, and then she kept going on about it. I never knew it would happen to me, especially at this school.
Good morning.
Morning.
我说你在看什么东西？
哦，我在看那个 coronavirus report。学校有关于这方面的 bullying 的话，你要跟我们说，要跟老师说，知道吗？这是不对的。
嗯。
This Chinese restaurant was texting their customers saying, none of our staff have been to China. We have no contact with the coronavirus. Please, come back to us. And people were making fun of it.
There are thousands and thousands of cases in Italy, but no one's boycotting Olive Garden.
Yeah.
No, seriously, no one's boycotting a mom and pop's pizza place. It's the same thing.
Historically, pandemics have stoked xenophobia. In the 19th century, people spread rumors that Irish immigrants carried cholera, and tuberculosis was known as the Jewish disease. In 1900, when a Chinese man supposedly died of the plague in San Francisco, Chinatown residents were forcibly quarantined by police, while white residents were allowed to leave the area. It seems like since the start of the coronavirus outbreak, schools have been a petri dish for racism. It's dangerous to normalize behavior like this for people my age. So you just spoke with the other student, so can you tell me what happened?
She understood my frustration and anger. They didn't really mean to say that, and they were actually making a generalization, and so she apologized to me. I really appreciated it.
Coronavirus may have originated in China, but the disease doesn't discriminate in the way that people do. It's extremely important that people have accurate information on how to stay safe. so we can kill this virus without spreading another one.
Thank you, Tim, and we'll switch back to the slides. But really powerful, right, coming from these teens, young adults who are experiencing this and trying to speak out, which I think is quite remarkable. So let's move to the next slide. As was mentioned in the video, this is nothing new. And so I have to give a disclaimer. Obviously, I'm a psychiatrist. I treat individuals who've experienced events like this, but I am not an expert on the history of this. I'm not a sociologist. That being said, I think it's really important that all of us, even those who are not historians, understand a little bit of the history. Turns out that the history of anti-Asian discrimination in the United States is a very long one. I've given here a quote from a New York Daily Tribune article describing the Chinese as uncivilized, unclean, filthy beyond all conception. In fact, as mentioned, the Chinese, the Irish, the Jews have often been stereotyped as foreigners, as dirty and diseased. But this stereotype has been particularly remained affixed to Asians. In the early 1800s, Chinese were commonly regarded as, quote, dirty, heathen rat eaters. And in the previous image that was underneath there, you could see an advertisement printed right where I am in Boston that says rough on rats. And it basically equates Chinese people not only to eating rats, but to being rats and needing to be cleared out. So we can click the next link. Basically, these dehumanizing images, which then got equated with a term called the yellow peril. This idea that Asians and Chinese immigrants were moving here, dirty, spreading disease and vice, just really placing into the American imagination this idea of what Asians were. And what followed were actually legal sort of manifestations of that. So there were a number of anti-Asian immigration restrictions passed. Some of you may know that the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which prohibited immigration from China, was the first and remains the only law to have been implemented to prevent all members of a specific ethnic or national group from immigrating to the United States. There were later things, including the Dusky Peril, so-called, which followed the rise in Indian immigration and were afraid of Hindu hordes invading the country. But you can see over and over again, there were acts passed, partly through this negative stereotyping and also through, I think, fear of economic competition. Next slide. Okay, and so one thing to also recognize is that Asians have remained stereotyped, and one of the stereotypes that we face here is because we look different, like literally a minority of appearance. And so regardless of whether we were a yellow peril or later coined the model minority, we were always considered to be sort of different and outside the mainstream. And most of you all know the history as well of the Japanese internment camp. In 1942, President FDR ordered more than 120,000 Japanese Americans into these camps, kind of out of a fear that they were sort of treacherous and remained disloyal to the United States. Over 60% of the people in the internment camps were actually United States citizens. So it's pretty remarkable that this was allowed to happen. The term model minority gained greater appeal and usage in the 1960s. And it was actually welcomed by Asian Americans, sort of a very different view than the yellow peril. This view says that Asians are actually the quote unquote good immigrants, that we make a lot of money, we have high levels of educational attainment. And many scholars have actually argued that this has been used to contrast with other minorities who are not model minorities, who by contrast are not working hard or maybe lazy. Unfortunately, this pits us against each other, and it also really erases a lot of differences. Not all Asians clearly are the same, but that's the problem with racism. It basically treats everyone the same. And so this timeline just shows the uneasy place that we've continued to hold in American society. Some of you may know the murder of Vincent Chin, in which he was mistaken for a Japanese American during the height of sort of economic anxiety about the Japanese auto industry, and he was beaten to death by a group of white Americans. And now we're at COVID. Next slide. And so I'll be wrapping up shortly, but I do want to make this central point that being a model minority is not enough. It does not protect us from racism. And we've seen these headlines, doctors, nurses, it doesn't matter. They're still being attacked, still being bullied and considered to be less than. Next slide. And as was pointed out as well, coronavirus fears show how quickly the model minority become the yellow peril once again. Next slide. So as a psychiatrist, I just want to make a point, which is that racism does exert harmful outcomes, particularly on mental health, but even on physical health. And so some of the data and evidence we have for this come from prior examples in history in which an event became quote unquote racialized, such as during World War II, Japanese internment. The Japanese individuals who were interned had more mental health problems, lower well-being, decreased life satisfaction, even increased suicide. But they also had increased cardiac disease and all-cause mortality or death. Next slide. And so what can we do about it? I think exactly what you all are doing now, coming together as a community, reporting it. The Stop AAPI Hate website is a great example. Don't be silent about it. Tell people about it. We have to talk about it, and that's why I think this event tonight is so amazing. Parents need to talk to their kids about these things that are happening. Support those who've experienced it. Importantly, stand up and speak out for everyone who is attacked in this way, not just when it's us Asians, but this racism is happening all the time, and we perpetrate it ourselves. So I think we all need to stand up against it and get engaged in the community as we fight back. Next slide. I'll just close by saying, obviously this is not over. We've seen a resurgence in headlines, and this is just one. But next slide, several people have pointed out as well that even though all of these violent attacks are happening in our community, they're still not being reported. And that's one of the harms of the model minority myth. This idea that we're so successful and we don't need help. It's not true. We actually are struggling and we need to speak out. And with that, I'll turn it over to my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Hum.
Next slide. America in Korean is migu. The word migu is based on two Chinese characters. Mi means beauty, 국 means country. So putting those two together, it becomes a beautiful country. When I was growing up in Seoul, Korea, like other South Koreans, I had a fantasy about America, a beautiful country with a charming people and mesmerizing land and captivating economic opportunities, equality, democracy, and justice. But the longer that I have lived in America, I have learned that not everyone is equal. Not everyone is treated equally. In this beautiful country, the COVID-19 pandemic revealed its ugly and despicable side of America. Next slide, please. So since COVID-19 pandemic, it has been a highly anxiety-provoking time for Asians to live, to work, to do the normal things like going to the grocery stores, not only because of the fear of coronavirus, but also because of the fear of dehumanization toward Asians, just like Dr. Chen talked about. The next slide, please. So Cindy Liu, Brigham and Women's Hospital, and I wanted to understand the nature of COVID-19 anti-Asian discrimination. So what do you mean by the nature? We wanted to understand the prevalence. How common is it? We wanted to understand the impact of anti-Asian discrimination on mental health of young adults. We also wanted to understand the types of anti-Asian discrimination. Finally, we wanted to understand the reaction by Asian as well as non-Asian young adults in related to anti-Asian discrimination. Next, please. So we launched an online survey. It's called COVID-19 Adult Resilience Experience Study. It's called CARES. So we are fortunate to get more than 1,000 young adults participating in this survey. The age group was 18 to 30 years old. It was about 30 minutes survey. And 212 Asians and Asian Americans participated in this study. The next, please. So what we found was that as a first result, nearly 50% of the respondents reported that someone commented about Chinese or Asian people being the source of virus, or someone had made a comment about Chinese or Asians eating habits. And what's really interesting thing is that almost 15% of the people have reported that they or themselves or their family members were the victim of verbal assault or physical assault. Next. So we wanted to see the relationship between those people who were exposed to violence versus not exposed to the violence in terms of their mental health. So what we found was that those people who were exposed to violence had elevated level of anxiety and PTSD, which is a post-traumatic stress disorder. The next, please. So we wanted to see, after controlling for important covariates such as lifetime discrimination and pre-existing PTSD diagnosis, whether or not COVID-19 discrimination still has a unique impact on the PTSD. And yes, there was a strong relationship between exposure to COVID-19 discrimination and PTSD symptoms. Next, please. So one of the things that we have done was that not only we ask these quantitative questions, we asked one questions about, are there experiences that we missed in the survey so far that you wish to add, describe? And interestingly, half of the people have participated in this text, writing about their text. And 20% of the comments were all related to anti-Asian discrimination, regardless of their races. And these two comments are based on the Asian Americans' experience. One person said, my dad sent me a text about an Asian woman who got acid thrown at her and tells me to be careful. I tell him, I live in a predominantly Asian neighborhood, so it's okay. But in reality, I'm scared. We live in fear. Another person said, I haven't faced discrimination, but I also haven't left the house in close to for 4 weeks. In fact, I fear leaving the house because I have heard reports of multiple attacks in and around my neighborhood. I want you to remember that this survey was based on young adults, not the elderly people who are becoming victim of this, assault, physical assault right now. So next, please. So we also was able to discover the types of COVID-19 anti-discrimination. There were 3 different levels. One was societal level, second was interpersonal level, and intrapersonal level. Societal level was political discrimination, which is a Wuhan virus. I was calling it as a China virus. And interpersonal virus was 2 different types, which was a direct discrimination, direct confrontation, or the vicarious discrimination is a sort of indirect way of experiencing discrimination. The perfect example is that going through the online, you see the online, from the online, you see all this kind of discrimination going on. And intrapersonal violence is, which is interpersonalized, internalized discrimination. So people of color often internalize racism, and they can also lead to a great conflict within themselves. Next, please. So these 2 comments are based on non-Asian American young adults. First, my youngest cousins are 2 and 5 years old and have been kicked out of the preschool because of their race. This person was very angry about what had happened to their cousins. Another person said, it is exhausting and almost makes me feel hopeless. Even though racism is being exposed in an institution, public figures and authority, there is denial and resistance to reform them, which makes me feel distressed about it. So obviously, this is not only affecting Asian Americans, it is also affecting non-Asian Americans. Next, please. So moving forward, as Justin talked about, we had a very painful history of anti-Asian discrimination. This is not only Asian history, this is American history. And how do we change this? What do we have to do to stop, eliminate discrimination? We need to develop a long-term vision. I like to use the ABCDE. A is that it's important for Asian Americans to be allocated resources equitably. And then number 2 is we need to start building solidarity within and between the diverse racial and ethnic groups. C is we need to start creating networks to support each other. We need to start creating the small groups, many different types of small groups. And we must devote our time to take an action and report and do something about it when you see the injustice and when you experience injustice. Finally, we need to keep educating our own children, our colleagues, and our friends, everybody, in terms of our richness and complexity of Asian history and current lived experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris and Justin, for sharing the history around anti-Asian discrimination and its current impacts on children's mental health, and for advocating for the changes that needs to be addressed. Next, we are honored to invite our next group of speakers, beginning with one of the lead authors of the Parent Guide on Talking with Teens about Anti-Asian Discrimination, Catherine Wilkie, Assistant Professor and the Director of Asian Mental Health at William James College.
Thank you, Jiaming. And I am so happy to be able to present, to really debut our parent guide to everyone here today. So before we start, I wanted to introduce two people that were key in developing this parent guide. First, I wanted to introduce Ellen Yang. She's a third-year student in the clinical program at William James College. She's a student leader in the Asian Mental Health Program, as well as the key developer for this parent guide. In addition, we have Ms. Michelle Mu, who is Ellen's mom. Michelle is a certified family coach and the parent consultant on this project. In the beginning, as we were, the team got together to discuss, how are we going to develop this parent guide? Ellen said to me that her mom recently became a certified family coach and was looking for opportunities to work with Asian parents. And that idea has been the best idea ever because Michelle has been key in giving us feedback from our parent support group on what has been useful and not useful as we were developing this guide. So at the start of this pandemic, I saw an increase in referrals for adolescents for depression, anxiety, and self-harm behaviors in my clinic. I heard stories from children being bullied and teased because of the China virus. One story comes to mind of a 12-year-old boy who referred because he was cutting his arms. When asked if he knew why he was there to see me, he said, "I'm in trouble because I am bad." He was teased and told he was dirty and stupid for eating bats. He did tell his teacher, who said to him that the kids were just teasing him, joking around, he should just get over it. I mean, this is a young boy who had just come over from China a year ago. He was so confused and he truly believed the virus was his fault. At that point, I had turned to the mom and she had tears in her eyes and she asked me, what can I say to him? Is it not true? It did come from China. It was at that moment that I felt both the helplessness of the child and the mom and really had to think, how can I help parents validate and protect their children? So as we were talking about this, and a grant opportunity came up and a colleague of mine suggested that we create a 1 to 2 page parent guide. Well, by the time we were finished with this, it turned out to be 12 pages long, just because there's so many important information and tools and strategies that we wanted to include. And so the purpose of our discussion today is to talk about why it is important for parents to begin the discussion of racism with their adolescents. And more importantly, is an opportunity for parents to look at their own understanding of racism, perhaps how they have been dealing with racism and discrimination in their own lives. We will touch upon some of the strategies and tips and hope that you will find this guide informative and useful. So next slide, please. As you can see, we've translated this guide into 4 Asian languages, and we hope that we'll be able to translate them in others soon. Right now, we have it in Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese, and Chinese. It was really important for us to have this accessible to the Asian community, whether it's in English or in their own native tongue. So I wanted to bring Michelle and Ellen together today to really talk about how we developed this guide, why it's important, and then to give you some tips and tools. So Michelle, for this first question, I wanted to ask you, why were you interested in this project? Why was it important for you to join us?
I am a Chinese. I came from China 30 years ago. Most of my education was finished in China. My kids grew up here. but I don't know how their school life is. I don't know how they deal with their friends and classmates. When we talk about this guide, I have no idea about the long history of racism and how it impacted my kids. I felt like I needed the skills on how to help my kids deal with the racism.
And again, Michelle, again, was so instrumental in providing us with that guide. Every time we would create some part of this guide, she would bring back to her parent support group. And again, they let us know what made sense to them, what didn't make sense to them. So in this guide, there are voices of parents and teens and adolescents, and this is why it's so unique. The second question I wanted to open up for both Ellen and Michelle. What message did you want to convey to parents regarding racism, and why is it important to talk about racism to their children? Ellen, I would like to have you start first.
Yeah, I would love parents to come out of this realizing how much potential they have to be a powerful protective force for their children, and also to come out of the idea that talking about it will traumatize them. Sometimes parents will be like, if we don't talk about it, then they won't get sicker, or like, you don't talk about it, it's better not to, or if I talk about it, it hurts them more. But when they are able to come to you for support and they don't have to hold that pain inside by themselves and be confused, when they can come out, share with you, connect with you, and feel supported and loved at home and with you, even when the world is not loving, that is so powerful and so protective.
Yes, and I wanted to follow up that. So with the adolescent teens that I see in my clinic, again, they want to talk about it. You know, I ask them and they want to share. And oftentimes they say that they're afraid to bring it up to the parents. They don't know how the parents will understand. And they don't want to hurt their parents if they talk about their experiences of racism and discrimination. And so again, twofold, parents don't want to hurt their children, and their children in turn don't want to hurt their parents. And so I think that's why it's important that we bring this up together now and to start having that conversation. So thank you, Ellen. So Michelle, I wanted to ask you the same question. What message did you want to convey to parents regarding racism, and why it's important for parents to talk to their children?
I think the big message is kids want to talk. They want to talk their feelings and emotions. As a big question for parents, the parents have to face racism and listen to their kids. We don't need to solve the problem, but we need to listen to our kids.
Yeah, so again, I want to follow up again. And oftentimes, I think parents are, anyone, right? As anyone who comes in and they're sharing something painful, our first thing is to make it feel better. So we problem solve. We tell them, you should do this, or don't think about it. And oftentimes, you know, the teens and adolescents will tell me that it actually shuts them down even more. They often just want someone to say, oh, I'm so sorry that happened, or that sounds really painful. And so for just a little reminder for parents to kind of take a step back and not always jump in with a solution, but really just sitting with your child with their pain. And so one other question I wanted to do in our discussion with Ellen and Michelle too is that, what did you learn from this process? Again, we had months and months and months of developing this project, a lot of information, and we had to filter through what we wanted to include and didn't include. So I want to ask Ellen first, you know, what did you learn from this process?
Oh, wow. This process was a huge learning process for me. So I kind of learned so much going through research and websites and everything. And there is so much Asian American history that I had no idea about. It wasn't taught in my public schools, and I went to a very well-funded public school. It wasn't taught in Chinese school or in the movies or the books that I read. And I also found that there is very little research and resources for the Asian community. It's not been a focus. It's not been an area that people are putting money into. So I learned that we need those resources. We need that focus. It's so important to talk about things that are difficult to talk about especially for teens, when they're trying to figure out themselves, how they fit in with the world, what it all means. And when we can give them the time and space to help them find their words or figure out their experiences and then validate them, that builds their resilience so much, so that when things happen, when they come up against hardship, they are able to keep going because they know that it wasn't fair or they did not deserve it.
Correct. So true, so true. And I think in the process of learning, and Justin had talked a lot about the anti-Asian racism, the historical timeline. And I just remember when we were talking about it, we were angry. You know, emotion is just emotions came up, and so we're adults, we're trying to manage our emotions. So we just imagine what our children are going through and not having the words to express their emotions. And so as parents, I think we can be very helpful in guiding them. And so Michelle, I asked the same question for you: is what did you learn from this process?
I learned a lot about the history of anti-Asian racism in the US. I was shocked and surprised. I felt bad that I did not know and I did not talk about it with my kids. I really wish that I knew it when they were young. I was shocked to hear from the parent support group. Many parents did not think their children faced racism in school. Parents only think their kids have peer pressure, but not racism. If their kids tell them there was a problem in school, the first thing parents think is that their kid doesn't have good social skills, and it's the fault of their kid. But something else is going on. Some parents said, of course they treat us differently because we are from different countries, we have different culture, but we deserve the respect here. Some parents also said, I know racism is there, but I don't want to bring it to my kids when they are young. But kids already experienced it. We cannot just keep our head down to ignore it. We should not be afraid of. We need to talk about it with our kids and help our kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that sometimes there's an idea that if you don't talk about it, it's not real or it won't hurt as much. But I can 100% assure you that these kids are on the internet. They are getting these on their social media. They're reading these articles about Asian elderly people being attacked. So unfortunately, we can't keep them safe from racism, but we can help them and be their support.
Right. Exactly. And so we wanted to, again, we wanted to debut the guide today, but we're not going to go through all 12 pages. What we did was we picked out certain slides we thought were key points and that to help talk about the tools and strategies of beginning to talk to your children. So if I have the next slide, please. So in one of the pages, we talked about, again, to go over why is it important to have conversations? What is the benefit from this? And this is really from research that Ellen had gathered. And so I'm going to turn over to Ellen to say a few words on this.
Yeah, we talked about how parents are super essential, right? But there's so much about these conversations about race that are linked to positive outcomes. So when they're able to understand these things, their self-esteem is going to go up. Their school engagement will go up, and their feelings of connectedness with their family will also increase. And that is just some of the things we've been able to measure and show that have changed from these conversations.
Right. So Michelle, did you also want to add something to this?
Yes, I think it's very important that we as parents continue to listen and learn with our kids, try to figure it out together with our kids.
Right. And again, it's so important is to re-emphasize that parents, we do not need to have all the answers. We can say that we're concerned, we're scared ourselves, but we're going to figure it out together. To go back to the story of the 12-year-old boy that was sitting in my office, after the mom said, what am I supposed to say to him? The first thing I want to do is reassure him that it was not his fault and that, we're going to do the best, mom and I. We're going to talk to the school and try to be the best is to keep him safe and to make him feel that he's okay and that he's not at fault. Again, the mom was so appreciative of some kinds of just what words to say to her son. Next slide, please. So another tool, another slide that we put in was, let's start listening and learning. And again, so important. Parents, you're not there. You don't always have the problem. So we keep emphasizing that. And we're like, listen first. And then also to think of that we can also learn from our teens and adolescents. They have a lot to share with us. And, and a lot of parents I know, is again, because you may not know the history of racism in the United States, and the kids do, is we can learn from them, and it empowers them that they're able to teach us something as well. And so again, these are just little quick little points that we wanted to bring up. Let's start listening and learning. Ellen, did you want to say something about this?
Yeah, so we kind of talk a little bit about creating opportunities for the kid to talk, and that's kind of to give them a place that's low pressure for them to talk. Because I know parents are like, well, I asked them right after school, like, what did you do? And they're like, meh, and they like run to their computer. But like when you have this low pressure family time where you're open and they feel comfortable, they start to remember that you are available and willing and invested in them. But also this second one idea of like validate feelings. So we talk about that a lot, but it's so important because I think sometimes in language, like in Chinese, we'll say like 别难过, 别哭, like don't cry, don't feel bad, or like 你想太多了. And it's just invalidation. It's like, oh, I shouldn't feel this way. Something's wrong with me, but I can't stop it. So something's wrong with me, and I just have to. I don't know. I don't know what to do. I'm just going to go to my room. And so when we can rewrite that, so that we aren't telling them those things, that can be really helpful for them to feel like there is hope and that they have that help.
很多时候，如果我们跟孩子讲说，我们跟你们经历过同样的事情，我们有同样的愤怒，会帮助孩子感觉到我们的爱。In lots of time, we can tell kids, we got the same reason, and we got the same feeling, we got same anger. So we can tell kids we are loved there and we are same with them.
Correct. I thank you both. And also, just what we say is be curious and respectful. I think it's so helpful. Right, and our tone really has a lot to it. It says, I'm curious, I wonder, right? So those words can be really helpful in opening up or giving your child an opportunity to open up to you. And, Ellen says create opportunities for your child to talk. It could be anywhere. It could be in the car, at the dinner table. It could be right before they go to bed. And I also want to emphasize that this is not just a one-time deal. So you don't take away from this, say, okay, I asked my kid and he won't respond, so that's it. This is an ongoing process. And many times kids may be like so surprised that you're asking them for the first time. And so they may not answer you. They may not say anything. But please be open, because oftentimes the kids tell me is that later on they will think about it more, and then they'll be ready to talk to their parents or to their adults, any adults in the family or their caretakers. So be patient, be curious, and give them the time when they do come to you. Next slide, please. And so one of this is a reminder, again, a reminder to parents, certain things that we're hearing from our teens and adolescents, and how they've, things that if this would be helpful for them to open up to the parents. So I wanted to see if Ellen and Michelle wanted to talk about this.
Yeah, this was just kind of like quick little reminders. because I work with a lot of children, and right now I work with Asian college students, and I ask them like, what would happen if you brought this to your parent? And they automatically go like, and I'm like, wait, what would happen? And they say like, oh, if I start this, then they're gonna blow up and they're gonna ask me so many questions. I don't have the answers. There's so many questions and I don't know what to deal with it. So it's just, I'm gonna shut down, and it's just easier not to even try. Or they'll think that like, then my mom gets really anxious and then we're both anxious and I just made her day a lot worse. So that's not gonna help. So being able to keep your calmness and give that share that with your child so that they can feel safe and be able to feel what they feel and process whatever they're feeling is so key to having these conversations, that they can feel like they can open up to you.
I feel like we really need to slow down. Don't judge. I really learned that we have to hold our opinion and we have to listen to get the feelings and the emotions. Lots of time, kids are assuming after they bring up the topic, parents will talk on them. So very important for us is listen. Let them release the hurt from inside. Let them feel our love and our support.
Great, thank you. I also want to point something out where we see the tip that says keep your face neutral and calm. And and so remember, parents, I know I had my parents, it was like this particular face that comes on when we start talking, and my parents had this look and I'm like, uh-oh, they don't want to know, or I'm bothering them. So it's really, really important that sometimes our nonverbal cues speak louder than our words. And so remember that we keep our face neutral, calm, and then that'll be much more inviting to our children to talk to us, and not looking stern or annoyed. So I just wanted to emphasize that. And so could I have the next slide, please? So this is our last one, and I think this is key to the parent guide. What is so special about this is these are actual quotes from the adolescents and teens that I work with in my clinic. And when I asked them, they were so excited to actually say, oh my gosh, there's gonna be a parent guide that my parents can actually learn and listen and look at. And so they said, if this was, if my parents asked me these questions, I have a lot to say to them. So some of them would say, do you feel safe at school? When or what will help when you make you feel safe? And again, the key to this is they're not talking about the COVID, although they're very worried about it, but more importantly, they're worried about going back to school and being bullied and teased. There was a great sense of relief when schools went remote, but now, as we know, there's talk about schools going back in full time. And so this is starting to have this effect and this anxiety for our kids again. I wanted to just ask for Ellen, I'm sorry, to comment, the last comment on this.
Yeah, this was so exciting. I was so excited when there were kids that were like, these are the things I wish people asked me. But it kind of gave me that reminder that I and all of us are always learning. Like this word, Ling Ling, I had no idea that this was a thing. But this is something that people, like teenagers, are using in a very negative, hurtful way on social media. So even like 5 years ago, I felt like I was young. But these teenagers were telling me I was old and to get off of like Facebook is for moms and stuff. And I was like, what? Excuse me. But I have to be open and like learning from them and not saying like, oh, that's weird or okay, but like being like, oh, that's your experience. That's what's happening right now. And that's kind of that process of like always learning from each other.
Yes, and that is key, right? And we're constantly learning from the teens and adolescents that we see. If you want to go to the next slide. And so again, this is just a brief taste of what the guide looks like, and we hope that you'll be interested enough to go to the link and to look at either the English version or the ones translated into different languages. So what were the takeaways? Not talking about racism is more psychologically and emotionally harmful to your children than talking about it. It's okay if you don't know, as long as you stay open and curious. Listen, listen, and listen. Very key. You don't need to problem solve. And parents are essential. in their child's social emotional development. You matter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine, Ellen, and Michelle, for creating and also introducing this guide so more parents can support their children at home. I wish we had more time to hear more of the stories of interacting with kids behind the toolkit, but I think we'll have more chance to discuss this during our Q&A portion. Next, we'll have Cindy Liu, a psychologist and assistant professor from Harvard Medical School, who will be speaking with us about the role of research in addressing these issues that we just talked about.
Thank you so much. Well, I just wanted to start off by saying that as a psychologist and a researcher, I didn't know much about studying all of this. I didn't grow up studying that culture, that the study of discrimination was a science. I knew chemistry and biology, those were sciences, but psychology, not so much. But when I was in college, I learned that you can actually measure these experiences and apply statistics to understand how one's cultural background and one's experience with discrimination can have an association with health. And this is an entire field of study. Next slide. Next slide. So while each of us probably have some idea or some theory for explaining or addressing discrimination or how to have these conversations with our family members, it's important to test these ideas through research, because when we do, we begin to develop better, more effective strategies for improving our health and our way of life. And at the same time, teaching and providing support to people through practice can help to identify new questions to test through research, which continues the cycle of research informing practice and vice versa. Next slide. So this is what my colleagues and I have recognized. We're providers and we're researchers, and not only do we try to listen and to children and families, but we're also working really hard to determine the best way for improving the lives of the Asian community. Next slide. And so to do this, we rely on community members and parents like you to participate in research, to share their experience, whether it be through survey or interviews. And you might ask, why should I take time to participate in a research study? I've never done anything like that before, and I honestly don't think my opinion matters. Well, for one, there's so much for us to understand, especially with Asian families. One important point to make is that in the US, Asian Americans receive the least amount of federal funding from the National Institutes of Health, just a tiny fraction of 0.17%. And so this is the least amount of funding compared to other groups. And so while there are far fewer resources directed to Asian children and families, we know that we need to actually gather more data. We know that while being exposed to discrimination has health implications, there's actually no wide-scale strategies to address this. Through the CARE study that Dr. Ham presented earlier this hour, we learned quite a bit about the discrimination experiences among Asian American young adults, but there's far more work to be done when it comes to understanding children and families and how they communicate. Next slide. For this reason, my colleagues and I began the Pandemic Resilience in Asian Immigrant Study of Experiences, which we refer to as the PRAISE study. And our mission is to learn more about the experiences of Chinese and Korean immigrant parents during this pandemic through online surveys, particularly with regard to their experiences of parenting, stress, social support, and how they've been resilient during this time. And as you can see, our materials are translated into Chinese and also Korean. Next slide. So who can participate? We are hoping that Chinese and Korean parents who have immigrated to the US or Canada and who have at least one child under the age of 18 can participate in our study. Next slide. The survey will take about 30 minutes, and this is because there's just so much for us to learn, as I mentioned before. This study is completely voluntary. It's confidential. You're not identified by name by any means. And as a token of our appreciation, we will give a $10 Amazon gift card for parents who do this survey. Next slide. So we hope that you and your friends that you may know, anyone in your community and your networks might be able to participate. And if you are, you can sign up right away. To reach our survey, you can go to this website or use this QR code. If you have any questions, you can directly email us as our information is on the website. Thank you so much for hearing about our work, and we look forward to reporting back to you what we learn.
Thank you so much, Cindy, and to all of our other amazing speakers. I know all of you very, very well. I know that you know this, but it was so wonderful to hear, and I learned something new every single time. And as a clinician working directly with youth and families for the majority of time, I especially appreciate and value the work, Cindy, that you and Chris do in the research realm, and want to echo Jiaming's sentiments from earlier. There's so much more that we could talk about. So at this time, I'd like to invite all of our speakers to kind of come back into the virtual space. We are going to transition to a Q&A and panel discussion, and would like to remind the attendees who are here with us that you can submit any questions or comments you have in the Q&A box that's located on your Zoom menu bar. For those of you who are less familiar with Zoom, there should be just a little area there that says Q&A. You can submit questions there. We really, really, truly would love to hear from all of you. We want to try to recreate the feel of being in a room together. So please submit questions or comments, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can. There is, I know, so much we'd like to discuss, and I see the questions already pouring in. So again, we'll try our best. You can bring the slides down, please. Thank you. So hopefully I can see all our panelists. So I'm going to just jump right in, you guys, because I know there's a lot to cover in a small amount of time. To start, I'm going to direct to Justin and to Chris. You both talked about this already at the beginning of our webinar. There is a lot of research and evidence showing we know very, very well the experiences of racism, are harmful to both physical and mental health. So could you both speak briefly to the mental health effects of racism, specifically on teens and young adults? So what are the impacts we most worry about, or what might parents see? And perhaps, Justin, we could start with you.
Absolutely. So I had mentioned in my talk that, as you said, there were both physical and mental health impacts. But even upstream from that, I think the message I want to send across is that racism it can, especially interpersonal racism, like what we're talking about, where someone yells at you or calls you something or even attacks you, it's a form of assault, even if it's not physical. So if someone says something that's so harmful and strikes at the core of you, that person takes it with them and it sits with you. So it's a form of assault. It's like a stress. And just like other forms of assault, some people on the call may have heard of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. I would encourage you to think of it in that way, because what assault does is it makes you feel unsafe. And that's partly the point of it. Not always. Sometimes people don't mean to make it feel that way, but that's often the way it's received. And unfortunately, if we don't talk about it, people often experience racism almost with a feeling of shame, like they've done something wrong. They've done nothing wrong. They've just been themselves, but they've been attacked. And so if we think of racism, interpersonal racism, the form of assault, I think that is one way to understand the mental health effects, which then, like other forms of stress or assault, will result often in anxiety, sometimes depression, often an inability to sleep, insomnia. It just affects your mental health. And in the worst case scenario, could get to full-blown PTSD, where people actually have nightmares about it, they re-experience it, they may avoid areas that remind them of the stressful or racist incident. And so if it's getting to that point where it's affecting function, would definitely recommend seeking professional help.
Okay. So yeah, thank you, Justin. One of the things that parents need to really remember is that sometimes when our children are doing very well at school, we tend to think that they don't seem to have problems. When the parents think that, everything looks good, children look happy, they don't seem to complain about anything, then they think that, oh, okay, everything is good. I mean, look at that. I mean, they are successfully doing very well in the school and grades are great. So, racism is not really an issue for my kid. So a lot of parents tend to minimize the impact of racism. But our children are dealing with a lot of burden on the racism. So I'll give you 3 examples. So those are stereotypes of Asians. Number 1 is perpetual foreigners. What it means by that is that children feel that, this peers group is non-inclusive. So they feel like they're like aliens in their own lands. So they feel isolated. They feel like they don't really quite fit in. and they feel like the climate is different. They feel really uncomfortable. So because of that, some children are trying to compensate those kind of feelings of exclusion by studying even harder. And they have so much, anxiety problems and depression, but then they're trying to hide that. So that's number one. Number two is an invisible minority. I'll give you an example. I was invited to meet with 20 Asian American children. They were middle school to high school in one setting. So there was one Chinese American girl. She was at the time junior. She was so sparkling. She was bright. She was articulate. She was organizing the whole event. Just a joy to me and everybody. Obviously, she was, leader of the group. But when we were talking about this topic of racism, she said something like this. She said, at school, I constantly feel that I am an invisible minority. I want to be proud of being a Chinese American, but I'm feeling ashamed about being a Chinese because how China and Chinese people are being portrayed in the media. When we heard that, everybody was shocked. I mean, how can she feel ashamed? How can she feel that she's invisible minority when she is like sparkling and raising her hands all the time? But this is exactly how our children may feel. We don't know what we don't know. So number three is a modern minority. Justin talked about the myth of modern minority. And this is a common narratives that our children are experiencing. So one example is this. Because I'm Asian, they automatically think that I'm good at math, but bad at sports. And they think that I'm good at math only because I'm Asian. But actually, I have to work so hard to be good at math. So that's, there's stereotypes are pouring on our children. He is great in math and he's automatic. People think that automatically he's going to be bad in sports. Okay. And the stereotypes are really hurting our children. So I think the whole point of our webinar is that we cannot assume that our children do not feel this way, are not a victim of racism only because they don't talk about it, only because they are good at what they're doing at school.
Thank you so much, Justin and Chris. And I couldn't agree more, Chris. I think that's something I talk to families about all the time in my clinical work, just in terms of having things be talk aboutable and the importance of that, and all that not knowing what we don't know, I think underlies so many difficulties, not just with racism, but with a lot of mental health issues as well. So to that point, underscoring the importance of conversations and our need for more research in the field, this is switching gears a little bit, but Cindy and Catherine, for each of us here, and I'm speaking for myself, I know we all have personal motivations for doing the work that we do and working specifically to support the Asian American community. So I'm wondering if you both could speak just briefly about your personal motivations for the work that you do. So for Cindy, for Project Praise, for example, and your other research efforts, and also the educational and clinical work that you do, Catherine. We'll start with you, Cindy.
Yeah, well, I shared a little bit about just my exposure to studying psychology and mental health. And what I recognized when I was just undergrad taking a psychology course was that a lot of the models for understanding cultural experiences or just behavior were really rooted in the cultures of other groups. And what I quickly realized was that I didn't think that much of that would apply to Asians. It was just very clear to me that much of it would be somewhat problematic if it were applied to Asians, in fact. And so in exploring this further, I realized that there wasn't that much that was being done to really to sort this out. There were certainly researchers in the field, but I would say in the past 20 years, there's just been an emergence in interest among students who've now gone on to study this area, including Ellen here, who've really tried to make a difference in our community. But that was my motivation. And to this day, we still see, again, lack of funding in this area. And I think there's also hesitation in the Asian community with respect to participating in research. Like, what are people going to do with my data? What is it going to be used for? Will I see the benefits? And that's all really legitimate, thoughts about about what it would be like to participate. But without having that information being provided to us researchers, it really doesn't allow us to be able to answer some of the questions that are actually posed here. It just makes it very difficult because we actually don't know. And so that is my motivation for doing this work.
Thank you. And so my motivation, so it's kind of twofold. So I wear multiple hats. I'm a clinician at South Coast Community Health Center. I'm also a professor at William James College. So in order to have research, Ellen has said there's very little research on Asian Americans. And so when students ask me, so what's the research? Why the interventions? Why are you doing this? We need research. We need students to come in and do this, but we also need the clinical world to inform us how to do really good research for our community. And so I hold that balance. And the work that I do at the clinic, I love working with my teens and adolescents, and I absolutely love meeting with my parents. We have these questions all the time. Parents come to me, my children don't talk to me. They talked to me when they were 5 or up into 3rd grade, and all of a sudden they switched and they no longer wanted to talk to me. I don't know how to connect with them. And so my motivation is really bringing that bridge for our parents and for children. And again, the emphasis that our kids want to talk to parents. They just don't know how, and they really feel that parents are too busy, and they're just not sure that they want their, and also the communication language barrier. And so my motivation is really bringing that bridge for the children and for the parents.
Thank you, Catherine. I think you and I both are primarily clinicians, and I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, so I spend the large majority of my time with kids, teenagers, young adults. And I think that's absolutely true. Even especially parents of teens, not to stereotype teenagers, but they'll often say, oh, my teenager doesn't want to talk to me. But I actually find it's really, really not true. And of course, developmentally, there's a lot that teens and young adults want to hold on to their own. But the reality is there's so much that kids really, really want to talk to their parents about, and they really want to feel heard and understood. And to underscore a point you made earlier, Catherine, about parents not always having to know all the answers. I think that's also definitely true. This is not about having to have the answers, but about having those lines of communication open. So to that end, I'm going to switch gears a little bit to Ellen and Michelle. I know the two of you talked about, the creation of the guide, all that you learned through it. And I know that the two of you had a lot of probably very difficult conversations about racism through the creation process, possibly even between the two of you. And I know, Ellen and Michelle, you both talked as well to many students and parents to help inform the creation of your guide. So I'm curious, there are probably lots of things, but curious, why do you both think it's so hard for kids to speak with their parents? And what was the hardest for the both of you? And is there any advice you might give on how to make the conversations feel a little bit easier? Anything that comes to mind for either of you? Ellen, would you like to start?
Sure. Let's see, you brought up a lot of things, and why is it so hard? And, I don't know if there's a lot with verbal expressions of love and everything. It might not be something that was passed down from as a family characteristic, but also the idea of if we hide it, then it's not true. Then people won't see it. And if we don't talk about it, then it won't hurt them. And also the idea of harmony, right? Don't rock the boat, don't make and we feel as if we bring it up, we're bringing anxiety to them, but that doesn't have to be the case, as if they're able to have these conversations. And being more comfortable with the uncomfortable is such an incredible skill to nurture. And I'm constantly uncomfortable. I'm just whatever. But when we can start being okay with that, then we have so much potential to do things that matter to us, to talk about things that matter to us, and to grow from there.
Thank you, Ellen. Michelle, I don't know if you have other pieces you might want to add in terms of why it's so hard or what might make it easier. or for you, what made it easier for you when you were starting to have these conversations with Ellen?
Mama, unmute.
You're still muted. Michelle, if you just unmute your mic, please. Thank you.
As a parent, we are it's a very hard to think about our kids in school, in their environment has racism. We cannot help them. So sometimes we just afraid to talk about that. A lot of parents group just reject to talk with me about this topic. So it's very hard for parents to face to racism.
I think, can I just add one more thing?
Of course, please, Chris.
Yeah. I think the part of the reason why is that parents, especially parents who are from other countries, China, Korea, or other Asian countries, they didn't grow up with racism. They didn't really experience the racism. So I'll give you an example of mine. I came to America when I was 22 years old. I grew up in South Korea. And I grew up as a very proud Korean person. And when I came to America, I was trying to learn English and I didn't really get it. I didn't really, people are mentioning me like, oh, your English is really good. And I was like, oh, thank you. Okay, in the beginning. And then it was like after 15 years, 16 years, 17 years, and I began to grasp some kind of non-inclusiveness and just kind of the climate issues that I was beginning to understand what it means to be experiencing racism. So, in part, one of the things is that, I feel kind of shamed that I was experiencing this. And at the same time, sometimes I don't want to talk about this because it's so painful to me to even admit that. And how can I communicate this painful experience with my own kid? So, and sometimes we don't know, we are not, we never learned about this and we have not been educated about how to practically, we don't have a practical guidelines. So even though this is my research area, I'm learning constantly and I'm reflecting and I'm thinking about what would be the best strategy to deal with this issue. I think there's no simple way and there's no simple prescription of 1, 2, 3, this is what you have to do. No, it is not true because this is such a painful story, painful experience. And there's so many things that we need to learn about, but we need to try this out because this has been our history. This is American history. This is Asian American history. And unless we experience our own pain, we are not going to stop this. So I think we all have to learn how to be painful and grasp it, or work together.
Thank you, Chris. I so appreciate your passion as always, and it's so eloquent about it. And I think it underscores, and Alan mentioned this as well, kind of continuing the conversation, learning to be comfortable with the uncomfortable, so to speak. And events like this and continued conversations at home will hopefully start making small differences little by little. We have so many questions. I'm going to group them in a little bit. And I'm also mindful of time, so we're going to just squeeze in 1 or 2 more. There was a question about, since the toolkit is aimed for teenagers, and this I'll direct first to you, Catherine, or if anyone else has something to add on. But since the toolkit is aimed for teenagers, do you have any recommendations for talking to young children at their developmental level? And a separate question, how can we have conversations with, say, parents or grandparents who aren't identifying or labeling an incident or encounter as racist, even though it is? Catherine, could you start with one or both?
Yeah, so I actually went through some of the queue and I saw that, and actually to be developed, that we are going to try to do another guide for children with younger parents with younger children. And the reason being is that one of the participants is a child care provider in Boston, and so she was very excited when I talked about this. And so we will be developing another guide, hopefully. But one thing I want to say is, being mindful of language and what your child is able to understand. So younger children, having all these big conversations is not going to help, but maybe doing an activity together with them, coloring, asking them to draw something. We always ask, like, when you draw a picture of something that makes you happy or makes you sad, whatever it is, if you can do any activities together. There are actually in our guidebook, we do have resources how to talk to younger children, and videos that are actually been identified as helpful for parents to talk to when they have younger children, younger than the adolescents and teens. So go to that, and then again, those are the starting steps. And Julian, I don't remember the second question, but that was
if you, I know it's going in the other direction, but how do you have conversations with parents or grandparents when they aren't viewing an episode or incident as necessarily racist? How do you address that or begin the conversation?
So again, in my clinical work, I see a lot of adults, and with everything that's happening right now, again, it's so in our face, right? There are so many different texts. I ask them directly, what are your thoughts about this? Because oftentimes they don't think it is a racist attack, but when we unpack it, we talk about, how did you make you feel? Well, I felt scared. What does that mean? And so then it's just like with teens, you just start asking the questions, be curious. Right. And so I think that is the starting point for any age group.
And being mindful of time, just one last question I'd like to direct to Ellen and Michelle. Really briefly, because I know we're a little bit past time, but curious, Ellen, if there's just one or two things you wish parents would understand about what it's like to be moving in this world as an Asian American. And after that, Michelle, same thing for you. Any advice you would give, just one or two things, a piece of advice that you might want to share with parents before we say goodbye today?
I think that, the lives that each generation lives can be so incredibly different. I have no idea, what it would be like to grow up with people that look like me. This semester was my first time being in any classroom with mostly Asian American students. And that's not something that my white classmates had. And when I went to China and was surrounded by people that look like me, it was weird. I was like, this is odd. I don't know what to do with this. And that's not the experience that my mother had. And so it is so hard sometimes when we have such different realities to kind of connect. But when we are able to have these conversations, connect, and feel emotionally connected, we can overcome those differences in perspective and experiences.
Thank you so much, Ellen. And Michelle, I don't know if there's just one or two pieces of advice that you might want to share with parents.
Because we grew up from China, we are from different country and we educated differently. We have to learn from our kids, slow down and talk with them, listen from them, because we grew up from very different environment. We have to learn. If we shouldn't have the solutions, but we can open our heart and let them feel our love and support.
I love that line, Michelle, about opening your hearts. Thank you so much. I do recognize we're a little bit past the webinar end time. We have just a few more closing remarks, and I just want to acknowledge, I know there were so many questions in the Q&A we did not get to. So during our close, our esteemed panelists are going to try to help answer some by writing. So stay tuned. And just as Catherine said, just like there is hopefully a guide part 2, as a team, we've talked as well about perhaps offering this webinar, different versions of this webinar to help continue the conversation. So please stay tuned for that as well, because clearly there's so much interest in the community. So at this point, we'll transition, Jiaming, to our next slide.
Thank you, Juliana. Next slide, please. Yeah, so for those who want to learn more about the guide or download a free copy, please visit the William James website or our center website in the chat box. Next, please. To learn more about PRAISE study, please go to projectpraise2020.com or use the QR code. We need our community input and hope many of you will consider participating. Next, please. UCA has created a WeChat group for those who would like to continue the conversation, and you can scan the QR code to join. I know we should leave the QR codes for a longer time, but we really need to get moving. So next, please.
Do you want to go back to that last slide and people can take a quick photo for those who need it? Please bring up your phones, take a photo, then we'll move on to the next slide. Thank you, Tim. And for those interested to learn a little bit more about the work that we do, our center supports the emotional wellness and long-term success of students with a particular focus on Asian students. We create resources and services focused on mental health education, and we offer webinars like this and plan to offer more in the future. And we will absolutely make this a priority, this topic a priority, given the level of interest and engagement. We also, as you all heard, conduct research regarding populations we serve. So for those of you who have interest, please, please, please let us know if you have interest or questions about the Project PRAISE study. And at the close of this webinar, there is a very brief 2-minute survey. If you all could take a little time to answer, it would help us know what kind of resources develop for all of you, the community in the future. And next slide. In addition to our parent guide and the mental health resources available on our center website, there are also a range of additional resources related to anti-Asian racism online, including just the few listed here. We can send these out to all of you and encourage you to access whatever resources nationally or locally to where you are. Next slide. Special thanks to our speakers and all those who made today's event possible, including, of course, UCA and Lily Chen, with deep appreciation for their commitment to supporting Asian youth and families. Tremendous thanks to our team, including Tim He, Xia Chao Jiang, and Fifi Wang for their dedication and tireless work behind the scenes. And last but not least, a thank you to all of you for joining us and staying through to this very end. A final reminder to please, last slide, the previous slide, please. A final reminder to share your own stories, to stand up, to speak out, to listen and to be open to learning from others, most especially our children, and to keep supporting our larger community and those most vulnerable. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm sorry that we ran a little bit late, but so appreciate everyone's interest and engagement on this very important topic. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.